Well, maybe some of you remember about 7 years ago, there was a lot in the news about a judge in Alabama who was fighting a fight to keep a monument of the Ten Commandments in the county courthouse. I remember that, but I don't remember this detail about the story. It seems that whenever this particular judge went out into the area to speak about his cause, he would take that monument of the Ten Commandments with him on a flatbed truck. Now this was no small task, because that monument weighed 5,280 pounds. That's like 500 pounds for each commandment. And I read that when he came back after a series of speaking engagements, and the monument was replaced, that the crane that moved it, which was this huge 57-foot crane, would actually buckle under the weight of the Ten Commandments monument. Now, that caused a writer named Thomas Long to reflect that that may be a good image of the Ten Commandments for some people. Because for some people, the Ten Commandments are a burden, are like a weight around the neck. When they think of the Ten Commandments, they think of somebody shaking their finger in their face and saying, "Thou shalt not." And yet, if you really look at the reading that we shared today, the very first phrase of that particular section is a proclamation of freedom, where God says, "I am the Lord your God, and I have brought you out of slavery, out of the land of Egypt." And the message, Thomas Long says, is something like, "Because I am the Lord your God, you are free to worship me. You are free from the tyranny of other idols. You are free to rest on the seventh day. You are free from allowing coveting and murder and stealing to shape your life. You are set free." Another commentator that I was reading described it in this way. She said, "The Ten Commandments allow space for us to live productive, meaningful, fruitful lives before God and with one another." That the theme of the Ten Commandments is radical commitment to God and to other people. Well, those are some pretty lofty comments about the Ten Commandments. I'm not sure that most of us think about the Ten Commandments in those sort of lofty terms. Most of us, I think if we were raised Lutheran particularly, think of the Ten Commandments as something we had to memorize in confirmation class. Now, we still make the kids memorize the Ten Commandments. We just don't make them memorize Luther's explanation to the Ten Commandments, like I had to back in my youth when we had to work so much harder to be confirmed. Though back in the Dark Ages, that's right. Or maybe when you think of the Ten Commandments, you think of that which is encased in the lost ark that Indiana Jones is always trying to locate. Or maybe you think of those Ten Commandments as the thing that is always fought over in those culture wars between, church versus state culture wars. Or, if you're my age or older, this may not be true if you're under 50, but if you're my age or older, you think of who? Charlton Heston. There you go. The younger ones are going, huh? The movie, The Ten Commandments, which was the first movie I ever saw, where Charlton Heston is standing up above the people of Israel as they're, cavorting around the golden calf, and he has the Ten Commandments and he smashes them down. That's what you think of, don't you? Sure you do. I hate to tell you, there's some biblical inaccuracies in that story. I don't want to burst your bubble, but anyway. So we think, well, you know, the Ten Commandments are part of the promise that was made between God and the people of Israel. And the covenant was, this time it's a two-way promise. And the covenant is, I'm your God, you are my people, and your part of the deal is to keep the commandments. And they don't do a very good job of that. Well, all of that's true. But today I want us to kind of move beyond all those images that we have in our minds of the Ten Commandments and think about the Ten Commandments not as something of the past, not of something old, but of something that is God's gift to us. Before that, though, we're going to have a little quiz. We're going to have a little quiz about, I should make them repeat the 10 things that Peter and I named, but no, we won't do that. Our quiz is about what we've talked about the last 2 weeks, because we're in the midst of this series about the Old Testament lessons and God's promises to us. So, it's really a review. I'd love to make it a quiz, though. It's a review. The first week we talked about the story of God as it's told in the story of who? Noah. It must have been at the Baptist that they were doing Jonah. 3 weeks ago. In the story of Noah, not Jonah, in the story of Noah. And the message was that we are always loved and God is always good. Yoo-hoo. Okay, last week we had the story of Abraham and Sarah, and the message was that God keeps God's promises, and that part of growing in faith is coming to a point where we trust that that's the case. And so we talked about how to develop trust, that God keeps God's promises, and one of the things we talked about was becoming more thankful. And I challenged all of us to make a list as they occur to us in the next week of things for which we are thankful, things that are a blessing in our lives. And I said I was going to try to come up with how many? 50. I came up with 30. I'm sorry. I guess I need to learn to be more thankful. Anybody come up with 50? See, look at the popes. The model, oh, given their name, yeah. They're our model of thankfulness up here. Also, you'll notice around the church are these various signs that I've posted that you can write down that for which you are thankful that has occurred here at Faith Lutheran Church during the last 55 years to help us remember that God's power and presence has been at work among us. Okay, so we've so far learned that we've learned about God's grace, we've learned about God keeping God's promises, and now we're going to learn about how to live as God's people. That's our focus for today. And there's 2 things I want us to think about, maybe a new way to think about the 10 Commandments. One is that the 10 Commandments, each of the 10, shows us a way to love God. And the second thing is that the 10 Commandments provide for us freedom, which I don't think is necessarily something we always think of. Now, in confirmation class, and maybe in Sunday school too, usually when we talk about the 10 Commandments, we say that the first 3 are about God, and the next 7 are about people. About how we treat God and how we treat people. But actually, each one of the 10 Commandments is a way that we can love God and people simultaneously. Let me explain what I mean about that. This is actually from a writer named David Gill. And he stresses that if we keep the commandments, we are simultaneously loving God and loving people. So let's take the first one. I am the Lord your God. You shall have no other gods before me. Well, obviously, we're loving God because God is our only God. But David Gill writes, we're also loving people because it's to the benefit of our neighbor if money is not our God, or if power is not our God, or if the need to seek revenge is not our God. So it's to everyone's benefit if we worship God above all else. And not only that, it's to everyone's benefit if the God we worship is a God of grace and mercy and love, rather than a God that would have its people seek revenge or somehow be on top. So, to love God above all else is a way to love people. On the other hand, thou shalt not murder. Well, that's pretty obvious how that benefits your neighbor. It sure is to your neighbor's advantage if you don't kill him or her. But on the other hand, it's also a way of loving God. Why? You're not harming his children. That's right. God created all people. And whenever we harm God's people, whether or not we think it's justified, I believe at least that that is painful to God. That God is grieved by that action. So by not murdering or not taking someone's life, we are loving God and loving God's people. So, the Ten Commandments are simultaneously ways to love God and to love God's people. They also are a source of freedom. Now, that's been true from the beginning. The people of Israel had been freed from slavery in Egypt when they received the Ten Commandments. And so it wasn't one of these deals of, if you follow the Ten Commandments, I'll free you from slavery. They were already free. They had already received God's grace. And so the Ten Commandments were intended to be that which would help them maintain their freedom and to live lives of love and of justice. There's another author that puts this a little bit more firmly. Her name is Barbara Brown Taylor. And she says, and I probably have said this before in a sermon, that the Ten Commandments are not suggestions. They spell out for us what God's will is for our lives. And if we fail to follow them, we do so at our own peril. Well, and it's not because God's standing over us with a hammer to hit us on the head, but because the Ten Commandments, if we follow the Ten Commandments, we are walking the way of life and of hope, of love. If we don't follow the Ten Commandments, we are walking the way of death. That's what she says. Oh, come on, what's the big deal? What does it matter if we covet a little? I mean, really, everybody covets. Everybody wants something that someone else has. I mean, isn't that the basis of all advertising? People didn't covet, you know, just destroy the American economy. We have to covet. And yet, if you look at the most recent edition of the Lutheran, there's a column in there, which I just happened to read yesterday, so I didn't incorporate it completely in my sermon. This gentleman, though, traces every single ill in the world, practically, back to coveting. And what difference does it make if we catch up on our work on Sunday morning so that we can have more time during the day to spend with the family, which is important, and do the things which we enjoy, that's important. And besides, productivity is the American way. Well, it's kind of a slippery slope. You know, maybe once in a while is okay. But that certainly can become a habit. And before you know it, we're not honoring the Sabbath day as a day, not only to rest, because our bodies need rest, and God knows that, but also to worship God. And what about misusing God's name? That's another one of those things that, what's the big deal? I mean, what if you say every once in a while, "Oh my God," or "God, that's an ugly dress." Our confirmation kids do that sometimes, and I raise my eyebrows at them, and they don't even know what they've done wrong. Because it's so much a part of the culture and of conversation. And yet, isn't using God's name haphazardly like that a way to not honor God? And even more importantly, isn't it a way, when other people hear it, that lessens our witness? Says that somehow God isn't important to us because we would use God's name in such a non-productive way. But it's so easy. I mean, it just sort of happens. And of course, we would never kill someone. All of us can say, "I would never kill someone." But we might neglect to help someone who is suffering. Or we could say, "I would never, I can tell you for sure, I'm not going to bear false witness against my neighbor. I'm not going to tell lies about my neighbor." Well, yes, but we might fail to speak up when someone else is telling lies about an individual, just because, we don't want to get involved. And let's see, what else is in there? There's, of course, the coveting thing. We already covered that one. There's one, stealing. Stealing, we wouldn't steal. But we might overlook if a mistake is made to our advantage. And then there's that darn thing about paying income tax on stuff you order online. I mean, my accountant makes me claim all that stuff. Is that stealing? If I don't? That's something to think about, don't you think? Do you think that if at the end of every day we paused and we looked at the Ten Commandments and we said to ourselves, how am I doing when it comes to fulfilling these 10 commandments? Not just the narrow sense of the commandments, but the broad sense of them, like Martin Luther talks about in those explanations we don't make the kids memorize anymore. For example, when he says, you should not only not bear false witness against your neighbor, you should always speak of what your neighbor does in the most positive light. Whoa. Oh, I forgot the honoring one. I have to say that one for the sake of the young people here.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Alex, you pay attention? Sorry, Alex, I couldn't resist. I've known you since you were little. Oh, that was an eye roll. I saw that.
Right on point.
Right on point. Honoring your parents and elders. Sometimes we think, well, we don't want to push that too much because we want kids to have good relationships with their parents and people who are older than them. But there's that slippery slope again. I mean, it's not too long before, if you don't teach people to respect other people, then the next thing you know, people feel like they can say whatever they want about anyone in authority. And the next thing you know, it's not just that people are criticizing someone for, legitimate shortcomings, but they're actually slandering people who are in authority. Not that we ever see anything of that in this political climate in which we are currently finding ourselves. See what I mean? Slippery, slippery slope. So what if every day we stopped and we said, how am I doing when it comes to keeping the broad sense of the Ten Commandments? It reminds me of Sister Maureen on Wednesday night, reminding us, what if you stopped every day, a couple times a day, and you said, how am I doing when it comes to being Jesus to other people? I mean, it's sort of an understatement, but don't you think that our world and our lives would be better? We would be freed from a lot of the pain and the consequences and the ugliness that surrounds us. Maybe that's why a church I read about, right after they do the confession and the forgiveness is proclaimed, they all say the 10 Commandments together in order to remind themselves about how God wants them to live. And maybe that's why Thomas Long says that the 10 Commandments are not a heavy rock like the monument that we wear around our necks that weighs us down, but the 10 Commandments are more like a dance. Grace is the music, the 10 Commandments are the steps, and they allow us to soar. That's a little bit lofty for me. But I can say with confidence that as we are attentive to the 10 Commandments, we are loving God, we are loving the people that God made, and our lives are blessed by freedom.